The American soldiers who landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day had experienced some of the most intense and costly combat of the entire Normandy invasion, fighting their way across a beach swept by German fire, suffering thousands of casualties in the struggle to establish even a minimal foothold, and spending hours pinned down under circumstances where survival itself seemed unlikely. The 5th Corps and 7th Corps units that fought at Omaha and Utah beaches believed they had encountered the worst that D-Day had to offer, that their experiences represented the upper limit of what amphibious assault demanded, and that their hard-won advance of perhaps a mile or two inland represented reasonable achievement given the opposition they had faced. It wasn't until several days after the landings, when liaison officers began sharing information about how other Allied national forces had performed on their assigned beaches, that American commanders and soldiers learned the details of what Canadian forces had accomplished on Juno Beach. And the realization of how much further and faster the Canadians had advanced created a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and confusion about what had gone differently. The basic facts of Canadian performance on D-Day were undeniable and documented in after-action reports that American officers read with increasing discomfort. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade, had landed on Juno Beach facing defensive positions that were at least as strong as those at Omaha. I had taken significant casualties during the initial assault phase when landing craft were hit by German fire and when troops crossed the beach under heavy fire from bunkers and prepared positions, but had nevertheless pushed inland with remarkable speed once they had cleared the immediate beach defenses. By the end of D-Day, Canadian forces had advanced further inland than any other Allied forces, except for some airborne units that had been dropped behind German lines. The Canadians had penetrated 7 to 9 miles from the coast in some sectors, had captured several towns and villages, and had come within sight of one of D-Day's major objectives that was supposed to have been reached by British forces, but that remained in German hands because the British advance had been slower than planned. The American reaction to this information was complicated and revealed assumptions about military effectiveness that the D-Day results had challenged. Some American officers initially questioned whether the reports about Canadian advances were accurate, suspecting that either the Canadians were exaggerating their achievements or that intelligence about their positions was based on incomplete or misleading information. The skepticism reflected partly competitive instincts between Allied national forces and partly genuine confusion about how one Allied army could have advanced so much further than others facing supposedly similar conditions. But as more detailed information became available, including verification from British liaison officers and from aerial reconnaissance that confirmed Canadian positions, American commanders had to accept that the Canadians had indeed achieved something that made American advances look modest by comparison. The officers who began examining what had allowed Canadian forces to advance so rapidly identified several factors that distinguished their approach from American operations on D-Day. The Canadian assault had been carefully planned with extensive rehearsals that had practiced not just the initial landing, but the immediate inland advance, ensuring that troops knew exactly what they were supposed to do once they got off the beach and that armor and infantry were coordinating their movements in ways that maintained momentum. The Canadians had employed specialized armor, funnies, including flail tanks, flame tanks, and bridge-laying vehicles, more extensively and more effectively than American forces had, using these vehicles to clear obstacles and reduce strong points in ways that allowed infantry to advance more quickly. The Canadian artillery support had been more aggressive and more responsive, with forward observers calling in fire that suppressed German positions and that allowed Canadian troops to keep moving rather than going to ground when they encountered resistance. But perhaps most importantly, Canadian tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive forward movement, with junior officers and NCOs pushing their units to keep advancing even when they were taking casualties, or recognizing that maintaining momentum was more important than pausing to consolidate positions or to wait for perfect coordination with adjacent units. This approach was risky. It meant that Canadian units sometimes advanced beyond their supporting artillery, sometimes created gaps between different units that German counterattacks might have exploited, and sometimes resulted in small groups of Canadians fighting in isolation when they outpaced the general advance. But on D-Day, when German forces were disorganized and when defensive coordination was disrupted, The aggressive Canadian advance had paid enormous dividends by penetrating German defenses before they could be reinforced and by seizing key terrain that would have been far more costly to take if the Germans had been given time to establish proper defensive positions. The contrast with American performance was particularly stark when American officers examined what had happened at Omaha Beach. The V Corps assault had encountered exceptionally strong German defenses, had suffered from preliminary bombardment failures that left defensive positions largely intact, and had faced tactical circumstances that were genuinely more difficult than those on other beaches. But the American response to these difficulties had been to focus on surviving the immediate crisis, on establishing a foothold, and on building sufficient strength to attempt inland advances only after the beach itself was secured. This methodical approach had made tactical sense given the circumstances American commanders faced, but it had also meant that opportunities to exploit German confusion and to advance before defenses could be reinforced had been lost. The Canadians, facing their own difficult circumstances on Juno Beach, had made different tactical choices that prioritized forward movement over consolidation, are accepting risks that American commanders had been unwilling to take, but achieving results that made the American approach seem overly cautious. The phrase, "we felt like amateurs," didn't appear in official reports or in formal communications between Allied headquarters, but it captured the sentiment that American officers expressed in private conversations and in letters home when they learned about Canadian D-Day performance. The phrase reflected genuine respect for what the Canadians had achieved, but it also reflected embarrassment that an Allied force that Americans had sometimes dismissed as less aggressive or less capable than U.S. troops had substantially outperformed American units on the war's most important day. The competitive dynamics between Allied national forces made these comparisons painful for American commanders who took pride in U.S. or military capabilities and who had not expected to be shown up by Canadians who were fighting under British operational command, and who had received far less attention in American media coverage of the war. The British reaction to Canadian D-Day performance added another layer of complexity to how Americans processed the information. British forces on Golden Sword beaches had also advanced less far than the Canadians. Despite operating under the same overall command structure, and despite having essentially identical planning and intelligence about German defenses, British officers acknowledged that the Canadians had performed exceptionally well, but there was also some defensiveness about why British units hadn't matched Canadian achievements, with explanations that emphasized the particular difficulties British forces had faced and the specific tactical decisions that British commanders had made. American officers watching this British-Canadian dynamic recognized that their own embarrassment about being outperformed by the Canadians was at least shared by the British, which provided some consolation but didn't change the fundamental reality that Canadian forces had set the standard for D-Day performance that neither American nor British forces had matched. The longer-term implications of Canadian D-Day performance affected how American commanders viewed their Canadian counterparts during the remainder of the Normandy campaign and beyond. Canadian forces gained credibility within the Allied command structure, with American generals who had previously been skeptical about Canadian capabilities now taking Canadian operational plans and Canadian tactical assessments more seriously. When the Canadians were assigned difficult missions during the fighting for Caen and during Operation Totalize later in the summer of 1944, American officers who had learned about D-Day performance were less likely to question whether Canadians could handle the missions and more likely to assume that Canadian forces would perform competently even in demanding circumstances. But the D-Day comparisons also created tensions that complicated Allied cooperation. Some American units that had struggled on Omaha Beach resented what they perceived as Canadian boasting about D-Day achievements, feeling that the Canadians hadn't faced circumstances as difficult as Omaha, and that comparing performances across different beaches with different tactical situations was unfair. Canadian soldiers, for their part, sometimes expressed frustration that American media coverage of D-Day focused almost entirely on American beaches and American units, ignoring or minimizing what Commonwealth forces had accomplished and creating public impressions that Americans had carried the primary burden of the invasion, when the reality was more complicated. These mutual resentments occasionally surfaced in disputes between American and Canadian units operating in adjacent sectors, with arguments about who should have priority for supplies or about which force should receive credit for capturing particular objectives. The tactical lessons that American forces drew from Canadian D-Day performance influenced how the U.S. Army approached subsequent amphibious operations and how American commanders thought about the balance between caution and aggression in offensive operations. Some American generals concluded that U.S. doctrine had been too conservative on D-Day, that opportunities to exploit success had been missed because units were too focused on consolidating gains rather than pushing forward, and that junior officers needed more encouragement to take tactical risks when circumstances favored aggressive action. These officers advocated for changes in training and in operational planning that would emphasize maintaining momentum and accepting calculated risks in ways that more closely resembled Canadian tactical approaches. Other American commanders drew different lessons, arguing that Canadian D-Day performance had been fortunate rather than skillful, yet that the risks Canadians had taken could easily have resulted in disaster if German forces had been better positioned to exploit gaps in the Canadian advance, and that American caution on Omaha had been appropriate given the circumstances U.S. forces faced. These officers maintained that comparing performances across different beaches ignored crucial differences in terrain, in German defensive strength, and in the specific tactical situations that different forces encountered, and that the proper lesson from D-Day was that different approaches were appropriate for different circumstances, rather than that one national army's tactics were superior to another's. The debate about what Canadian D-Day performance revealed about American capabilities and about tactical doctrine continued throughout the war and into post-war military analysis. American military historians examining D-Day generally acknowledge that Canadian forces had achieved impressive results. But explanations for why Canadians had advanced further than Americans varied, depending on which factors analysts emphasized. Some credited Canadian tactical doctrine and aggressive leadership. Some pointed to better employment of specialized armor and better coordination between different combat arms. Some suggested that Juno Beach defenses had been weaker than intelligence had indicated. And some argued that Canadian success had been primarily a function of German defensive failures rather than Canadian offensive excellence. Canadian military historians naturally emphasize different aspects of D-Day performance, arguing that the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division's achievements demonstrated the quality of Canadian military training and leadership, validated the tactical approaches that Canadian commanders had developed, and proved that Canadian forces could perform at the highest levels of modern warfare. The contrast between Canadian penetration inland and the more modest advances of American and British forces became a source of national pride in Canada, evidence that Canadian forces had played a crucial role in D-Day's success, and that Canada's military contributions to Allied victory had been substantial and important. The fact that Canadian D-Day achievements received relatively little attention in American or British popular histories of the invasion created lasting resentment in Canada about how the war's history had been written and about which nations received credit for Allied successes. The individual American soldiers who learned about Canadian D-Day performance after the battle had their own reactions that didn't always align with what their commanders were saying in official reports or in private discussions about tactical doctrine. Many American troops who had fought on Omaha Beach felt that comparisons between their experience and what the Canadians had faced were fundamentally unfair, that Omaha's defenders had been stronger and its obstacles more formidable, and that any force facing Omaha's conditions would have struggled regardless of tactical approach or leadership quality. These soldiers resented implications that they had somehow underperformed compared to the Canadians, feeling that their courage and their sacrifices were being diminished by comparisons that ignored crucial differences between beaches. Other American soldiers expressed straightforward admiration for what the Canadians had accomplished, recognizing that advancing 7 to 9 miles inland on D-Day, while under fire and while facing organized German resistance, represented remarkable achievement regardless of what conditions American forces had faced on their own beaches. These soldiers saw Canadian performance as inspiration rather than as criticism, evidence that aggressive tactics and determined leadership could produce extraordinary results, and that Allied forces were capable of defeating German defenses even when those defenses were strong and well prepared. For these Americans, learning about Canadian D-Day achievements reinforced confidence in ultimate Allied victory and in the quality of the multinational coalition that was fighting to liberate Europe. The phrase, "we felt like amateurs," captured a moment of recognition that military effectiveness wasn't simply a function of national character or of resource advantages, but rather depended on tactical doctrine, leadership decisions, training quality, and dozens of other factors that combined to produce outcomes that sometimes surprised even professional soldiers. American forces had entered D-Day with confidence in their capabilities and with expectations that U.S. troops would perform at least as well as any other Allied national force. The realization that Canadian forces had substantially outperformed American units on the war's most important day challenged those assumptions and forced American commanders and soldiers to reconsider what they thought they knew about their own military effectiveness and about their allies' capabilities. The long-term legacy of Canadian D-Day performance affected Canadian-American military relationships throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. Canadian forces gained respect within the Allied command structure that translated into greater Canadian influence over operational planning and into recognition that Canada could be assigned demanding missions with confidence that Canadian forces would execute them successfully. American officers who had initially been skeptical about Canadian capabilities became advocates for Canadian involvement in key operations, arguing that the Canadians had proven themselves on D-Day and that their tactical aggressiveness made them valuable for missions where maintaining offensive momentum was crucial. But the memory of being outperformed on D-Day also created lasting sensitivity among some American commanders about comparisons between U.S. and Canadian forces. A defensive attitude that sometimes made cooperation more difficult, and that occasionally surfaced in disputes about which national forces should receive credit for various achievements during the campaign. The competitive dynamics between allies that D-Day had revealed never entirely disappeared, even as American and Canadian forces fought side by side through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and into Germany itself. The respect that Canadian D-Day performance had earned coexisted with resentment about the comparisons it invited, and with American determination to prove that U.S. forces were second to none in subsequent operations.